Q1. What law is this commentary explaining? A. It explains the law of the seventh-year release of debts. Every seventh year, creditors must stop demanding repayment from their brothers. This is an arrangement of mercy so that the poor may have relief. Q2. Should this law be practiced literally today? No. Calvin holds that this system was designed for Israel's social structure and is not to be applied in the same form today. However, the underlying principle remains: one must not pursue the poor harshly for repayment. Q3. Why did Israel need this law? A. Because they were one people with a shared inheritance, like one family. If wealth accumulated in the hands of a few, the majority would be oppressed. God used this law to restrain excessive accumulation and to protect communal freedom and fairness. Q4. How is this related to the Sabbath year? A. In the Sabbath year, the land rests and the people rest. Since the whole land and society enter into rest, the collection of debts must also cease, bringing the entire community into a state of release. Q5. Was the seventh-year release a permanent cancellation of debt? A. No. Calvin argues it was a temporary suspension of collection, not a permanent cancellation. The law still commands lending. If repayment never occurred, lending would become mere charity. Q6. What actually happened in the seventh year? A. Legal enforcement and pressure were stopped so that the debtor would not be oppressed. After the Sabbath year, repayment could resume. Q7. Why does God still command lending to the poor? A. Because as the seventh year approached, people might become stingy, fearing they would not recover their money. God forbids this attitude and commands continued generosity. Q8. What is the point of the reference to Isaiah 58? A. The prophet rebukes the people for keeping the Sabbath outwardly while still pressing debts, showing they observed the law externally but lacked mercy, violating the spirit of rest. Q9. What is the central theological principle here? God establishes economic regulations not merely as systems, but to restrain greed, protect the poor, and preserve communal rest and justice. Q10. What is the application today? A. Even without a seventh-year system, believers must handle lending, collecting, and financial relationships with mercy, especially toward the poor, and must not use power to oppress. Q11. Does the text itself say debts were permanently canceled? A. No. It clearly says do not exact, but it does not say the debt ceases to exist, nor that repayment must occur in the eighth year. 12. Why do some interpret it as permanent cancellation? Because the word release naturally sounds like cancellation, and the emphasis on liberation and rest leads readers to that conclusion. 13. Why does Calvin interpret it as a suspension? A. From the context. The law still commands lending to the poor. If debts were never repaid, lending would lose its meaning. Therefore, he concludes it was a suspension of collection, not the elimination of the debt. Q14. Is this directly taught by the text? No. This is an interpretive conclusion, not an explicit statement of the text. The text only guarantees that collection stops in the seventh year. 15. What is the most text-faithful statement? The seventh year forbids collection. Whether the debt is permanently canceled is not stated, and whether repayment resumes later is also not stated. 16. What is the status of Calvin's view? A. It is a theological and ethical interpretation emphasizing that the law aims to prevent oppression, not to create a periodic debt erasure system. Q17. What is the shared emphasis regardless of interpretation? A. Do not oppress the poor through debt. Give them relief. Let economic life be governed by mercy. Q10. How does this law change the view of creditor rights? I. It shows that creditor rights are not absolute, but are limited by God's appointed times and the rhythm of rest. Q19. Why is this placed in the seventh year? A. Because the seventh year is God's Sabbath year. Land, people, and economic pressures all enter rest, showing that everything is under God's sovereignty. Q20. How should the release versus suspension debate be taught? A. Distinguish clearly. The text guarantees no collection in the seventh year. Permanence belongs to interpretation. Q21. How is this connected to the poor tithe in Deuteronomy 14? A. Both serve the same purpose: to provide for the poor so they are not excluded from the community by economic structures. 22. What is the function of the poor tithe? A. Every 3 years the tithe is stored locally to support the Levite, the sojourner, the orphan, and the widow, giving them a stable provision. Q23. How does this differ from the debt release? The tithe supplies resources. The seventh-year release reduces pressure. One addresses lack of provision, the other addresses the burden of debt. Q24. How do these two laws form a system? A. The triennial tithe provides material support. The seventh-year cessation of collection stops economic oppression, so the poor have both food and time to recover. Q25. Why use time cycles for relief? A. God institutionalizes mercy so that care for the poor is not occasional charity, but part of the social structure. Q26. What does this prevent? A. Chronic lack of provision, generational poverty caused by debt, and the use of wealth to control others. 27. Does this mean property is unimportant? No. Property remains, but it is limited by God's law and cannot be used to oppress a brother. 28. What theology do these institutions express? A. The land and resources belong to God. Humans are stewards. Therefore, resources must sustain the community rather than be monopolized. Q29. How does this shape covenant relationships? A. It makes economic relations brotherly rather than hierarchical. Q30. What is the core structure of the poverty relief system? A. It can be summarized in three actions: provision, the tithe; release, the seventh-year cessation; and rest, a new beginning.